police in New York say they have arrested a, quote, strong person of interest in the brazen Manhattan killing of United Healthcare CEO. Investigators say this man here, 26-year-old Luigi Mangione, was taken into custody after police got a tip.
He was arrested at this McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Investigators say an employee recognized him and called police.
All right, a crazy week that unfolded this past week as FBI, local law enforcement, all looking for this suspect that you just heard, 26-year-old Luigi Mangione, here to help us break down not only his capture, but the shooting that happened last week in the death of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, our buddy, FBI special agent, the author of The Queen of Cuba that you can see over my right shoulder, Pete Lapp. Pete, good to see you, buddy. Mike and Nick, thanks for hopping back on the pod with us.
Thanks for being back on. Well, thank you for having me back on. I really appreciate it. It's always great to see your smiling faces.
Oh, well, we appreciate that. Now that we're on a streaming platform and then people can see us on YouTube, they can listen to the audio. Let's give them some content here, Pete, because, you know, I texted you earlier today where we were talking about this. I was like, I need to find somebody who's hunted bad guys before that understands what, you know, law enforcement's going through here. So as I texted you, funny enough, he had not been caught yet. I think you and I were texting earlier this morning. So this is all kind of new information for us. So you heard a little bit of what played there from the local affiliate in Baltimore. I think this kid was from the DMV area, funny enough, and he got caught at this Altoona, Pennsylvania. But what do you make of, just first and foremost, law enforcement's investigation over these last 5-6 days as somebody who has combed to try to find somebody internationally and nationally? Like, what do you make of their investigations? And then what do you make of what played out last week in New York?
I think that from an investigative perspective, you know, it was 5 days from the time of the murder to this person's arrest. Let's just assume for a moment, you know, he's innocent until proven guilty, but let's assume he's the right guy. That's not a lot of time, actually, when you think about it. In a city of 8 million people, when you add all the visitors into New York City per day, a vast amount of potential suspects, really, when you think about it, and thousands of data points. One of the challenges that law enforcement has in these types of investigations, when they become high profile. I had a chance to work the sniper murder case way back in 2001 or 2, when in DC, 2 guys were running around and murdering people, pumping gas and going to the Home Depot. It was a horrible time after 9/11. The FBI sat on the call center that was set up for tips, and the amount and volume of tips that came in were unbelievable. And the challenge that law enforcement has is to sift through thousands and thousands of tips that are coming in and trying to separate the people that have obvious mental health challenges or, you know, are lonely and having seances and calling, you know, I had a dream last night, you're looking for this person, and finding those tips that are actually valid and actionable, and then sending, you know, resources to go investigate them. That becomes one of the biggest challenges. I wouldn't be surprised, you know, given how much this guy looks like the picture the police released. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody knew him, called at some point in time and said, "Hey, I recognize that guy," and I would be shocked, frankly. And one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is, you know, he apparently comes from a very well-to-do family, you know, an extended family, large Italian family in the Baltimore area. You know, you can't tell me that someone from his family didn't look at that picture and say, "Does that look like my cousin, my nephew, my son, my brother?" That's a question I have, you know, and maybe we'll get some detail on that. Maybe we won't.
When you think about like the nature of the murder, and we all saw what really looked like, and I'll throw this back a little bit to like some Day of the Jackal stuff. Right? Like there was no fairly nondescript person murders someone in broad daylight. from what we saw, including the fact that the bullets had some kind of writing on them or something imprinted upon them, to how in 5 days later this person is caught, was there a change in your perception from the nature of the murder and the likelihood or unlikelihood of this person being apprehended because of the scale and the escapability, I guess, of this now suspect, to this person 5 days later being apprehended? Does something not jive between the narrative we may have told ourselves about this person or someone who could do this to the reality of who actually may well be the shooter?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of on Twitter and even in our different organizations that we work with, there were a lot of homicide detectives that all of a sudden sprung up, and they were like, "This guy looks professional. He looks like he has military background. He looks like this and that and the other thing." We jumped to a lot of conclusions, and I think media, the movies, and all of that tend to perhaps plant seeds in that. I go back to my sniper murder. I remember watching a very, very renowned FBI retired behavioral profiler who said, "This is probably a white guy." You had the white van, and it turned out the who it was and who they thought it was is entirely, entirely different. So I think a lot of us got under this kind of mode where this is a professional, like he's disappearing, and the reality is he made a lot of mistakes. He did some things really well post the murder, but he made a lot of very dumb mistakes, and it shows a little naivete. We think that this guy might have been some kind of military trained person. He's a smart kid from an Ivy League school. Like I didn't have that on my bingo card. I have to be honest with you. It's just really quite the remarkable story based on what we know so far.
I actually want to just dive into that a little bit with you too, because as I mentioned, as an outside observer, just seeing like the video footage and everything we knew at the time, you just pointed out the fact that very early on there were some steps or missteps from the shooter that indicated that there's a lack of professionalism. This person is not all that special, and everything was immediately demystified, at least in the eyes of someone who's done the work like you have. What were some of the steps that stood out to you that just felt like, or some of the actions of the shooter, the lead shooter at this point, that just seemed like this person's not as special as we think he is?
Well, even in 2024, how far we're 4 years past the pandemic, almost five, he could have walked around New York City with a mask, a surgical mask, as if he was, trying to keep clean from, whatever is out there, and never would have got a good photo of him. It's the picture at the hostel, which allegedly he's pulling down the mask to flirt with a girl. That's the picture right there that launched 1,000 tips, frankly, I'm sure. And therefore, that to me is a mistake. Writing things on casings is a mistake. I mean, it points towards a hard motive that potentially will be shown in court at trial. I think tossing the bag in Central Park, the NYPD is the largest police department in the world. 38,000 sworn, 38,000 officers. They were going to surge and find this person, whoever it was, and covering even a city as dense and as big as New York City. They had plenty of resources to do something like that. So for him to have been callous and taking the bag, hiding it and dumping it, and so people could find it, I just didn't think, if that thing had been in a dumpster and on its way to, Fresh Kills, New York, you never would have found that. No one would have been able to find that. So little things like that, definitely the mask becomes huge break for law enforcement.
Yeah, speaking of law enforcement, you just mentioned New York City. Obviously, we were joking off air about this, that, I got bumped from a CNN segment because I'm not a law enforcement analyst. And I had joked, hey, well, I mean, I used to work across the street from the building where the guy got shot. So if we want to talk about New York City, we could talk about New York City. But I do want to play a clip for you first from New York City Mayor Eric Adams about this suspect when he was caught. Because remember, as the clip said at the beginning of the show, he got caught in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Funny enough, a Penn State University, a satellite campus. So there's a McDonald's around in that area where he got caught. Law enforcement down there and Governor Josh Shapiro gave a presser. But I want to play what New York City Mayor Eric Adams said about the suspect and how he matches the description. This is from a local segment that aired up there in New York. So take a listen to this.
He matches the description of the identification we've been looking for.
The man, identified as 26-year-old Luigi Mangione, was arrested at an Altoona McDonald's Monday morning on firearms charges after an employee called in a tip. Officials say Mangione was carrying a ghost gun and a silencer.
Also recovered was a fraudulent New Jersey ID, matching the ID our suspect used to check into his New York City hostel before the shooting incident.
So, Pete, you heard a little bit there from not only the mayor, but the deputy mayor as well, talking about this investigation. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit before about television, media, investigations, your work on the DC sniper case for all intent and purpose of a naming convention around that case. But can you tell us a little bit about, outside of us seeing Law and Order and the stand down between New York City police detectives and the FBI when they come in, can you tell us a little bit of how law enforcement agencies work in collaboration? Because as you mentioned before, every Twitter detective and their mother was saying, this guy's in Canada, he's gone. And then he gets caught, 240 miles away at a McDonald's in Altoona that I happen to know because I've been to Altoona before, as I mentioned, with the Penn State satellite campus. So, obviously, mistakes made by him, but the law enforcement agencies working together in collaboration, take us through how that actually works. Who stands down? Who does all the information gathering? Who supersedes, in terms of who's going to listen to what order and what?
Well, the homicide, it's a state charge, so New York City would have jurisdiction. NYPD, lead law enforcement agency on the investigation. I doubt they would have brought the Bureau in, the FBI initially. You talked about that kind of stand down thing, and I'm sure the FBI would have offered resources, and I'm sure NYPD would have said, yeah, thanks, but we'll call you when we need you. Once there's investigation that shows that there's a possibility that the suspect crosses state lines, NYPD would have to reach out to the FBI and get some multi-jurisdictional assistance on that. And there's no doubt that would have been something the Bureau would have done. From my understanding, all that going on, it's a person in a McDonald's who's there probably getting a Big Mac, who looks at this guy sitting there having a sandwich himself and says, that looks like the guy that's been on TV. And apparently one of the coworkers or workers there said, yeah, I agree. And they call local law enforcement. He's got his mask up, kind of like we talked about, hiding in plain view, if you will. And then cops show up and said, pull down your mask. And from what I understand, a young officer recognizes him right away. So, again, that hostile, big mistake pulling your mask down. The other thing with the fact that he's got the fake ID that matches what he was using at the hostel. These are things that, if he's a really smart guy, let's be honest. I mean, he is an incredibly intelligent human being, having gone through Penn and all the academic accomplishments he has. That said, that doesn't always equate to common sense. And I think that maybe would have probably led to his capture, if you will, making these small mistakes along the way where maybe someone who's a professional would have got rid of this, got rid of that, definitely got rid of the gun. Like having the gun on your person 240 miles away 5 days later. Now, if there's a plan to go kill somebody else, maybe there's a need to still have the gun on you. But one would think that if there's a massive manhunt, you might want to alter your plan if you have one, moving forward. Again, I go to this point where it's not sitting with me well that no one, based on what we know, no one from the family, no one from the extended cousins, no one from, his frats and his school experience looked at that photo and said, could be somebody else, but it could be this guy. And maybe they did. And law enforcement's not releasing that information right now because it's not relevant. But I would just be surprised that this guy he's got a pretty distinct look, good looking guy, jumps right out at you. And I'd just be surprised if someone didn't recognize him from that original photo. Who knows?
Yeah, Pete, I want to ask you about that because there was a couple of different photos, at least it appeared to the naked eye, with the Twitter detective, which I was a part of, saying that, hey, this doesn't look like the same person. The jackets are different, but now you get this guy caught with obviously different forms of ID, obviously. So he's trying to hide his identity and stuff like that. In terms of disseminating information to the public, we saw a lot of, at least over these last 5, 6 days, mixed messages, right? We think he came in from Atlanta, from Port Authority. We think he left New York, they said for sure. Like, can you tell us a little bit about, even in your investigation and background with the DC sniper case, like, so you're looking for exit points, entry points. Again, back then, maybe not as much camera technology sophistication as there is now. What is it that they're doing from an information release standpoint to the public to make sure that they don't hinder the investigation by putting out too much? Because it's a different time period now, obviously, with social media. What do you make of the way information has been disseminated to the public?
Well, you got to look at this from a controlled release information and a leaked release of information. And perhaps the information about Atlanta was coming from somebody, who was getting that information third and fourth hand. And perhaps that was a theory or a thread that law enforcement was pulling on, but not the only theory, if you will. So it's potentially that information got leaked purposely, but not purposely from the investigators, but maybe someone who was connected to the investigation who kind of knew a little bit, but knew enough to be dangerous. I mean, law enforcement agencies, I'm not going to cast judgment on any of them, but they are not leak proof. They can leak, and therefore that's possibly what could have happened in that situation. Somebody knowing a little bit, but not necessarily enough. Law enforcement will want to release officially information that it believes won't compromise the investigation, but will further it. And then what they're also going to do is weigh, as we kind of talked about, weigh the release of information, knowing that by giving the public some information, it's going to open the floodgates to the Twitter detectives out there, to the seance people, to the, all these different people that all of a sudden have something to do, and they can call 1-800-NYPD and talk to a real person for 20 minutes about what they think, and it gives them some time to have a conversation with a human being. And unfortunately, it takes people away from the real leads that are real actionable. And, wouldn't be surprised if someone did see him and recognize him and call in, and it's just kind of got lost in thousands and thousands of tips that NYPD presumably received from the general public, including, Twitter detectives.
In your work in the investigation world, I imagine there's a form of muscle memory that happens. So when a news story breaks like this, I imagine there's a part of you that automatically sort of goes into an analysis mode, or just something changes within you, or maybe your heightened level of perception, is altered or whatever. When you hear the news about what happened, like we all do, right? You're somewhere sitting, hanging out, news breaks. What sort of starts sparking within you? Obviously, you're not, a practicing investigator now, but what comes upon you when you hear that?
Based on the initial information, I certainly would have been asking the company to start looking at people who have been denied claims recently, had maybe angry, threatened litigation, had angry complaints over policy claims. I'd definitely be looking for that. Apparently there are 5 million legally owned silencers in the United States. Is there an all-encompassing list of those folks, or would I be able to start saying, well, give me everyone from New York, give me everyone from Pennsylvania? Are those leads that we'd be wanting to run down, so at least you have a population of people potentially as suspects? But even that, I mean, think about that the numbers there. I mean, it's a almost unmanageable group of leads and suspects that you'd have to be looking for, and you're almost kind of getting lucky, frankly. You're hopefully tracking down some legitimate information that is truly actionable, that you can hang your hat on, and you're comfortable in dedicating resources, because even with 38,000 people, you're still limited in terms of resources. And then the more people you bring in, the more potential you have for leaks, and that's a problem. And also, shoddy work. You don't know if this patrolman that's working from the Bronx is really up to snuff to work this very important lead that you just handed him or her. That could be it. And it's a big challenge when you're working something this massive, as many big investigations have encountered. The Unabomber case, for example, I know there's a lot of parallels because he apparently has quoted Kaczynski's manifesto, and that investigation was a massive investigation run out of the FBI in San Francisco. And the New York Times, when they got his manifesto, actually wrestled with publishing it. And they finally decided to publish it. And the breakthrough for that was Kaczynski's brother read the manifesto and said, "That sounds like my crazy brother," and had a letter from the brother and got it to the FBI. And even after they got it to the FBI through the Washington field office, a friend of mine, I wrote about this in my book because I worked with the agent. It took her calling the FBI in San Francisco twice in 3 months to convince them, like, hey, you should really read this letter, because they were getting a massive amount of leads that were really hard to manage. And then finally someone read the letter and said, yeah, we gotta pay attention to this and take a look at this. So it's just becomes overwhelming after a while. And moving forward, I'm just really impressed with it that it took them only 5 days and that he was arrested peacefully. He didn't kill anybody else. Those are all wins for law enforcement.
Yeah, well said. And by the way, go pick up Pete's book, The Queen of Cuba, over on Amazon, wherever your books are sold, or you can go to petejlapp.com. But Pete, I got a question before we let you go here, because let's just say, for instance, right now, because again, this is the alleged suspect. You heard Mayor Adams there in saying that he does match a description. He did have a weapon that was similar. He had the fake IDs consistent with the hostile. Let's just say, for example, this isn't the guy. So you're the law enforcement investigator here on this. What is law enforcement doing right now? Because I can't imagine they're packing up the boxes and saying, "Yep, we got him. This is all signs point to him." So take us through those steps right now of what law enforcement is doing, just in case this isn't the person and the tracks that they're covering.
Well, I think first and foremost is taking that gun and taking those spent casings and doing a firearms analysis of that, because if those two match, and it is never 100%, but it's from a scientific perspective all but done. If that happens, he is the only suspect and he's the guy. So at that point, they could, take their boxes and close them up and start focusing on getting ready for trial with him. I would hope that they're probably looking at other folks just to be careful, just in that event that does happen. But I mean, based on what's public at this point in time, I think it's a pretty solid match, quite frankly. And if that weapon fired those casings, and the worst job in America right now would be being his defense attorney, because he or she has got a very difficult job in front of them trying to get their client found not guilty.
Pete Lapp, like I mentioned, the book Queen of Cuba, an FBI's agent insider account of the spy who evaded detection for 17 years. And guess who caught her? The guy who's right here on the podcast with us. Or you can go to petelapp.com to check out all of his work. Pete, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the podcast, giving us a couple minutes here to kind of break down this case. Continued success to you, my friend. Please stay safe.
We had a lot of people to help that caught her, so it was a team effort, as was this case with this guy. But thank you guys, I appreciate you.